Hello, everyone. We are here again with experts from the Department of Political Studies in Bar-Ilan University, speaking about contemporary issues in politics. And today we have with us Professor Jonathan Rynhold, who is the head of our department. He's also an expert on US-Israeli relations. His 2015 book on US-Israeli relations won the Israeli Political Association Annual Prize. And he has recently published articles about the Democrats in Israel and the future of US-Israeli relations. Hello, Professor Rynhold.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. I'm happy because today we're going to talk to you about Biden's visit to Israel, his upcoming visit in the next days. And I would like to ask you a few questions about that because we all need to learn more about what is going to happen and maybe what is not going to happen. Why is President Biden coming to Israel?
Well, thank you, Yulia. President Biden is coming to Israel for a number of reasons. First of all, President Biden has a long history of being pro-Israel. He is the longest serving politician with a pro-Israel record in American politics, going back to the year he entered Congress in 1973. And the fact that Netanyahu is no longer prime minister has made it possible for him to come because the relationship between Netanyahu and the Republicans was so strong, it became toxic for the Democrats. But that's just a facilitatory factor. It's not the cause. There are two other issues that come together that are bringing President Biden here. One is to do with Iran. By this stage, the administration had hoped that it would have re-entered the 2015 Iran deal. However, that has not happened primarily because of decisions taken in Tehran. And so even if the agreement is rectified and is brought back into existence, because of changes in Iran's technological capabilities, such an agreement will not keep Iran 1 year away from the bomb, which was the whole purpose of the 2015 deal. Therefore, whether or not there is an agreement, the United States needs to demonstrate to its allies in the region that it's reliable and that it has a plan B, that it has some kind of way of keeping Iran a year away from nuclear weapons, whether that is with an agreement or in the absence of an agreement. And in the wake of the Abraham Accords, Israel has been cooperating more and more openly with the Gulf states, particularly those which it now has diplomatic relations, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and also those with which it doesn't, notably Saudi Arabia. They are now part of the same American military command, CENTCOM, and their military leaders of the countries have met inside an American framework and are working together on an early warning system for missiles launched by Iran and its allies. So President Biden is coming here to further develop and facilitate that and to encourage it. And he is also coming to help mediate between Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia about two islands which the Egyptians are handing over to the Saudis in the Red Sea, in the Straits of Tiran. Now, those islands are under the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. They are patrolled by the multinational force, which is made up of Americans. In other words, there are certain security agreements that are tied into the peace treaty. Because, as we know, when Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran in 1967, that was the casus belli. That was the cause of the war in international law and in the politics. So when the Saudis take it over, they're going to have to accept certain obligations, and that is unusual given that they don't actually have diplomatic relations with Israel. And so President Biden will be mediating that. And he is able to give Israel things in the security realm that can make up for things that the Egyptians or the Saudis can no longer do or will be unable to do. So that is one whole side of the equation and one whole reason for him coming. The second reason for him coming is related And that is he's coming to the Middle East anyway because of the tight oil market, because the price of oil has shot up. And he would like the Gulf states to increase oil supply and therefore bring the price down and therefore bring inflation down in the United States and therefore put more pressure on the Russia and Putin in the Ukraine, because the lower the price, the less revenue Russia has. Now, it's a state secret as to whether Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates can in fact have that spare capacity. But no doubt there will be talk of if the Americans are able to show greater backbone vis-a-vis Iran, then perhaps the Gulf states will be able to find some oil tucked away under a carpet somewhere. And to tie this all together, Israel, as the only Western country, the only American ally which still has an open line to Russia, is also deeply connected into this whole Russia-Ukraine thing. And of course, it all comes together in Syria, where Israel is confronting Iran and Iran's proxies, while at the same time having to coordinate with the Russians to avoid hitting them there. So all of that together provides a global and regional security context for the visit.
I see. Wow. And this approach, sorry, of Biden to Israel and the Middle East, how would you say it is different from Trump's or Obama's approach?
So I think there's a very big difference in that President Biden is the last of the Mohicans. He's the last president who really, his frame of reference is the Cold War. His frame of reference is America as having a responsibility to provide global leadership and international security. And so he is far more willing to engage than both Obama and Trump, who tried to pare back America's involvement. And while it's certainly true that America doesn't want to play the role it did with boots on the ground under George W. Bush, he is far more willing to engage. He is also viscerally pro-Israel in a way that neither Obama or Trump were. In other words, for Trump, it was a domestic political calculation and a family issue. And for Obama, it was also a domestic political calculation. For Biden, it's something emotional, it's something personal, and it matters to him personally.
Surprising. Thank you. So let's wrap this up by thinking about the future a little bit. When you look at the future, is Biden the last pro-Israel Democratic president?
So I think that's a very serious issue. If one looks at Biden, he is probably the most pro-Israel Democrat currently involved in American politics. He comes from a different place where there were only 25 democracies in the world, and Israel was one of them. He comes from a time when Taiwan was not yet a democracy, and when they would say to the Americans, look, we can't be a democracy, we've got this big enemy, China, on our doorstep, American diplomats would tell the Taiwanese, but Israel manages. And so he has great admiration for that Israel and a great sensitivity to Israel's security challenges, because he grew up in an era when those were real existential issues. Today in the Democratic Party, there are two main groups. The moderates, who are basically pro-Israel because Israel's a democracy. And they would just like to see a two-state solution. So they may be critical of Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians, particularly the previous government, but their instincts are very much pro-Israel. The other wing of the party is liberal. And while most of them still see Israel as a democracy, some of them on the left of the liberals, the progressives, and they are the younger part of the party, so they are going to become stronger, see Israel in a racial context, like blacks and whites in America. And in the same way that they side with blacks as the weak party, they side with Palestinians as the weak party. And they are increasingly critical of Israel. And whereas other liberals will say, we still identify with Israel because it's a democracy, the progressives would say we identify more with the Palestinians because they are the victims, in inverted commas. And so this context is a context in which Israel and the Democrats are going to operate going forward. And there are three factors that will affect whether the more moderate wing or the more liberal progressive wing will dominate policy when the Democrats are in power. One of them is internal American politics. How dominant, how much will the racial issue be at the center of American politics? It was in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, but it has been since 2010. If that falls away and inflation and standard of living become more important, then that frame will become less significant. It'll be less of a priority. And we will see perhaps a less pro-Israel policy, but certainly not an anti-Israel policy. If, on the other hand, that frame persists to be very important in American politics, and if Israel is seen as not being willing in principle, at least in principle, if not in practice, to embrace two states for two peoples, or there is a sense in America that Israel's democracy is eroding, then I think it's going to be a very rocky road ahead for Israel with the Democrats.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Rynhold. That's with a very, very interesting summary of what is going on now and perhaps in the future. We would love to host you again in our video series.
Thank you, Yulia.
Thank you.